Good morning, everyone, or good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Ziyu Chen from the University of Hong Kong. So welcome to this Quantitative History Webinar series. So today we are happy to have Professor Joe Mokyr from the Northwestern University. So Joe Mokyr is Robert Strotz Professor of Arts and Science and Professor of Economics and History at Northwestern University. So he specializes in economic history and the economics of technological change and population change. He's the author of many books, including Why Ireland Starved, an analytical and quantitative study of the Irish economy, The Lever of Riches, Technological Creativity and Economic Progress, The British Industrial Revolution and Economic Perspective, The Gifts of Athena, Historical Origins of the Knowledge Economy, The Enlightened Economy and Economic History of Britain, 1700 to 1850. His most recent book is A Culture of Growth, published by Princeton University Press in 2016. So Professor Mokyr is going to talk about the book, and he has published more than 100 articles and books in his field. He has also served on many editorial positions and also as president of different associations, including he was the senior editor of the Journal of Economic History from 1994 to 1998, and was editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Economic History. He currently also serves as editor-in-chief of a book series for the Princeton University Press. Also today, we are happy to have Professor Jared Rubin to be a discussant. As many of you know, Professor Rubin has published very extensively, including his new book that just came out last year, How the World Became Rich, the Historical Origins of Economic Growth. This is written with together with Mark Koyama. Professor Rubin also has published a book, Rulers, Religion, and Riches, Why the West Got Rich and the Middle East did not. So as you can see today, we have two well-known influential economic historians to cover the history of economic growth and why some countries or some regions in the world got rich, others did not, and so on. So before I spend too much time on the background, let me very quickly mention the format again. So first, Professor Mokyr will spend about 1 hour to talk, to give us his insights on economic history, and then followed by a 15-minute discussion by Professor Rubin, and then my colleague, Professor Zhichen Ma, will take it on from there to read out some questions from the audience. So again, everyone, if you have any questions or comments, please post them in the Q&A box so that when we're in the Q&A segment of today's event, we'll get back to your comments and questions. So without further ado, Professor Mokyr. Joe, can you unmute? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm muted.
Okay, great.
All right, just a second. There we go. All right. Let me just move this a little bit. There we go. All right. I'll get going. This is the title, and just let me go straight into it. But I need to apologize because this is a workshop in quantitative history, And this paper isn't really quantitative at all. It's more sort of conceptual, so I apologize for this, but I hope that, if I get through, that some people at least will try to sort of apply quantitative methods to test some of the ideas that I'll be talking about. But this is an ideas paper. It really isn't there aren't any tables or any graphs, so I apologize for that. But the following is based to some extent on the book that Sivu mentioned, although I have added quite a bit of material. And so some of this stuff is fairly new, but this is the book that he mentioned, and this is sort of shameless self-promotion, which everybody engages in. But let me get straight to the point. And I've been interested for many decades now in the use of Darwinian models in economic history. Let me see if I can get rid of this. Hang on for a second. Yeah, that's better. And now, at first blush, I think it would seem that these models, that economic history should be amenable to such approaches, but in fact, their adoption has been slow. There's been something, and I want to give that credit. People have used some models of selection. You think, for instance, about the work of Galore and Moab of 2002 and Gregory Clark a few years later. And basically, their idea is a Darwinian idea, which is that if you have high quality agents who in some sense are more productive than others, they're also likely to have higher fertility rates or higher reproduction rates. And so their share in the population keeps rising. As their share keeps rising, the society gets more and more sophisticated and more advanced, and it gets richer. That's at least the sort of the idea in that model. These models are interesting, but they have a fair amount of problems. One problem is simply that human generation is just humans, aren't Drosophila. We aren't fruit fly. We multiply too slowly to be, in finite time to make much of a change. So, if you take these models seriously, then the Industrial Revolution should take place in about the year 2400, simply because of the fertility differential isn't big enough. But what is perhaps more disturbing, and that's something that I've been quite interested in, is that for something like an industrial revolution to occur, you really don't need the entire middle class to change, let alone the working class. I mean, for a long time now, I've believed that this may sound a little bit elitist, perhaps, but that if you're thinking about technological change, you really should be interested primarily in what I call upper tail human capital, which is that a fairly small group of the population, of intellectuals and engineers and philosophers and entrepreneurs and, highly competent artisans are the ones that mattered in the great takeoff. And so I think if that's the case, you really don't need these sort of Clark type of models to have population grow. And so this is a very tiny sliver of the labor force. There's a wonderful sentence that the great scientist Robert Hooke coined in the late 17th century, where he calls this a Cartesian army. Now, Cartesian is not Cartesian. It's based on Hernando Cortes, who, as we know, with a very small, well-disciplined army, conquered Mexico. And today that would be probably not something that people would be proud of. But Hooke was writing, in the late 17th century, when this still was considered to be a great achievement. And so upper tail human capital. So in a book that Cormac and Morgan Kelly and myself are working on, we estimate, and this is a bit back of the envelope, that perhaps when in Britain we're talking about 2 or 3% of the labor force, perhaps. And these are clever and ingenious mechanics, inventors and tweakers and people like that. And when you're talking about cultural belief and the importance of cultural evolution, you really want to pay attention to that elite group and the beliefs of that groups and their ideas evolved over time. And I call that process choice-based cultural evolution. And I'll try to convince you that that is in fact a useful term. So what was it that these people believed in? Well, the 18th century, the sort of century before the Industrial Revolution, say roughly speaking, of course, is what we Europeans call the age of the Enlightenment. And I think most of the people written about the Enlightenment sort of agree that it was basically an elite phenomenon. Okay, it was a phenomenon of intellectuals, of educated people. Now, this is mostly an intellectual elite and not perhaps one of these ingenious mechanics or high-quality engineers and artisans. But I think what all of these people share is some kind of commitment to human progress. And I think that's something that is certainly in the 18th century fairly unique to Europe. I don't see much of that almost anywhere else. And so what these people believed in that about three things about progress that are in fact separable. The first is that progress is at all possible, as opposed to some kind of cyclical theory of history in which there's no trend at all. Secondly, that it is desirable, which is disputed then and which is even disputed now. And third and most important, that it could be brought about by them. And they wrote down an agenda how to bring this about. And what they believed, and I think this is very easy to document, is that material progress could be brought about by what I call useful knowledge. And of course, by useful knowledge, I mean much more than just pure science, but a lot of sort of practical knowledge. It's like geography and arithmetic and all kind of industrial rules of thumb that depended as much on dexterity and intuition as they did on scientific principle. And so that useful knowledge could be then converted into what we today would call productivity growth. And what is more, as I said, they made practical suggestions about how to bring this about. And so that I think is quite critical, because if you don't believe in material progress through the expansion and dissemination of useful knowledge, it would have been hard for me to see how any society would have ever experienced something like an industrial revolution. Now, it's important to emphasize that I'm not suggesting a simple causal mechanism here, because clearly it's a two-way street, and the causality runs both ways. On the one hand, you need to believe in progress if you're going to bring it about. But if you have achievements, if you can show that progress is actually happening, then it becomes more credible to the people whom you're trying to convince of it. So certain sort of salient events, like the Great Voyages, for instance, and some things that people could really see, like smallpox vaccination or hot air ballooning or things like that, basically say, look, we can do more than people did before us, and that is what progress consists of. Okay, so now I'm coming to the heart of the paper, and that is, how can evolutionary models help us understand this kind of development? And so I need to talk a little bit about evolutionary models here, and to point out, how we should use that. And the first is, of course, to ask what exactly is the unit of selection. And here I would argue that unit of selection, unlike what say people like Galore and Clark would argue, it really isn't people, but it is idea, or if you want, cultural elements or cultural ideas, that kind of thing. And that gets rid of some things because it gets rid of the levels of selection problem, which I'll come back to briefly in a minute. But the idea is that cultural elements themselves, or if you want to call them memes, as Dawkins does, that's fine. I don't like that term, but people will use it. But the cultural elements themselves are subject to evolutionary forces. And that, of course, doesn't rule out that there could be higher levels of selection of individual humans and groups and so on and so forth. Now, it's important to realize that evolutionary models were designed for biology, but they really are larger than Charles Darwin or Richard Dawkins or anybody like that. And there's a paper that I co-authored with Jeffrey Hodgson and a bunch of other people in 2010 that makes this point, that evolutionary models really are a much broader analytical tool than that. And But the selection, of course, mechanism is different than it is in biology. In biology, natural selection occurs through population dynamics. And so nobody actually, it's called selection, but nobody actually makes choices. But in cultural evolution, people do make choices. They make choices in what I call the market for ideas. There are competing alternatives, and people actually choose things deliberately and consciously. And I think something that economists ought to be comfortable with. Now, what is it that makes cultural evolution Darwinian? And this is, there's sort of three elements that make it Darwinian. The first is that there is variation, so people can actually choose things, right? So cultures, much like species, contain a great deal of variation, and selection occurs because some people choose one thing and not another. Now, the cultural traits on which people choose things are shared among sort of reasonably well-defined groups of individuals that distinguish them from others, okay, not belonging to other groups. But these lines are fairly blurry, as they often are, and cultural overlaps are common. Give you an example, Jews and Muslims share a lot of things. They share a belief in a single God, and they have a taboo on the eating of pork, but they're clearly quite distinct in a way that's not too similar than two species that share the vast bulk of their genes and yet are phenotypically quite distinct and reproductively disjoint, meaning they can't intermate. And the second is that culture is passed on among individuals, and so it's passed either vertically from generation to generation, so from parents to children, or horizontally among separate units. So, genetic transmission, and we of course know this, occurs through mitosis and eukaryotic cells. Now, cultural transmission occurs through something which we call socialization and learning in cultural process. Now, it would be nice if children were socialized by parents alone, but that's not, of course, the way the world is. Children are socialized by other children. They are socialized by non-parents, and as adults, they can still be subject to persuasion, and I'm going to talk a fair amount about persuasion, and other forms of what you might well call cultural ontogeny, meaning, the way your culture evolves over the life cycle. And so choices have to be made. And so that's why the markets for idea matters, because the market for ideas, these choices are driven by persuasion. And I'm going to give you some example to make all of this quite concrete. And so what I'm interested here in is, of course, persuasion among those productive elites, that upper tail human capital that I talked about. Now, finally, what biological evolution and cultural evolution share is something called superfecundity, meaning there are too many cultural features. So again, individuals have to choose off menus, and not all the ideas that are ever proposed will survive. And this is the sort of Darwinian struggle for existence. And there are far too many of these ideas and proposed cultural traits that are produced, and selection must be made among them. And so a simple example is there are 10,000 apparently. Then I didn't know this. There are 10,000 distinct religions in the world and 6,800 different spoken languages, live languages. So no individual can possibly believe in all religion and speak all these languages. And so people have to choose, but how does that matter? Okay. Now, one or two footnotes is that there are significant differences between cultural evolution and the biological evolution, in that biological evolution is much more constrained than cultural evolution because of very strict conditions. And the strict conditions are basically three. Okay, the first is the so-called what is known as the Weismann barrier, meaning that acquired phenotypical characteristics are not passed on to following generations, right? So, this has been, of course, known for more than a century. If you take, this is two mice, you cut off their tails, you have them mate, their offspring will be born with tails no matter what. The second thing is that mutations are random and blind, so that there is no direction in mutation. You don't get the mutations you need. You get random mutations, but then the direction in evolution is imparted by selection on those mutations. And the third thing, and that's more complicated, I want to get into it, but that basically that evolution works on discrete units, basically, or particulate nature. But none of these things are necessary in cultural evolution. And there's a paper by Alex Missoudi that points that out very nicely. So, you have to be careful about these things, and you don't want to be shoehorning one theory or one set of problems into a theory that was designed for something else. And so there are all kinds of issues here that you have to be very careful about. I really don't want to push this too hard, which is one reason why I really don't feel that I ever know enough to formalize this on a bigger scale. For instance, it's not clear what is meant by species and speciation in cultural models. It's not obvious in culture what is exactly meant by a generation. In biology, it's obviously exists. And so there are issues here, and I don't want to make too much of it. And you can sort of see why a lot of people have doubts about using evolution in issues like economic history. One of the big differences between the two, and that actually does matter a lot, is that in biology, you can get your information, your genetic information, from at most two sources, right? I mean, you get some species, have maternal and paternal chromosomes, and others are uniparental. But one way or another, nobody gets chromosome from more than two sources. In cultural evolution, there's absolutely no upper bound on the number of sources that you can get in order to adopt ideas. And so people have said that this is that you can receive information not only at the moment of the emerging of gametes, but basically continues to the rest of your life. And this is what some people call Lamarckian. Now, whether this is actually Lamarckian, what Lamarckian really meant is of course hard to exactly determine. In fact, if you read Darwin, you realize that Darwin was a Lamarckian, which confuses the hell out of everybody. But that's just how it is. What is clear, however, is that innovations do not occur at random, much like mutations. People, work on certain areas in technology and in science because they tend to, for one reason or another, be regarded as high return. And so they're not random. And you might believe or not believe in induced innovation and sort of labor-saving innovation driven by high wages. But whatever is the case, it's quite clear that if society chooses to have, developing a nuclear bomb or a COVID vaccine or something like that as a high priority, innovations aren't going to be random, they're going to be directed. And this is, of course, perfectly reasonable. So how should one then think about an evolutionary approach to culture? And the answer, of course, I think, is to some extent that it just gives us a framework for explaining the evolution of historical outcomes that are complex, not designed, but the result of interactions meant for something very different, but also the adaptation of cultural beliefs to changing circumstances. For an economic historian, I think the advantage of evolutionary thinking is that it tries to explain why the present is the way it is, but also to realize that it didn't have to be like that, that it could have turned out differently, and how differently and where the bifurcations might have happened is a sort of an interesting debate in which we actually don't, I think, spend enough time. But it would be interesting to contemplate if circumstances had been different, that economic history would have turned out to be very different. One way or another, I think, much like evolution, economic history is a sequence of to a large extent unintended and unanticipated consequences of the choices that we make, that people at the time making them had no idea would be the consequence. And I think that is something worth thinking about. So I'm going to give you now a list of 9 advantages of a Darwinian approach to economic history, and then I'm going to give you a historical example of each of those 9 in trying to understand the Industrial Revolution, the rise of modern growth. So let me briefly go through those 9 and then come back to each of them and give you some concrete examples. So the first is that in evolutionary system, we have a fundamental duality of information and action. We distinguish between genotype, which is kind of a form of information, and phenotype, which is the way the organism looks and operates. And I think there is something to be said for that, for thinking of that duality. So culture is about matters of the mind. It's what we really believe, or what we prefer, or what we value. But the observable outcome, which is like a phenotype, are behavior and actions, and these are the outcome of these things of the mind. And so, we can talk about this in small letters here, but I don't want to spend too much time on that. So, secondly, I have to get to these 9 things fairly quickly because I still have a lot of slides. So, secondly, evolution is about the interaction between some kind of an environment, a pre-existing environment, and where the innovation is introduced, and the innovation itself. So as I said, innovation remains stochastic, even though it's not random by no means. We don't quite know why a particular individual comes up with a particular idea, and the likelihood of the idea occurring to anyone is affected by the environment and the perceived needs, but it's never certain. And but even if the flow of innovations were wholly predictable and wasn't stochastic, we would not be able to predict whether it was successful unless we can measure its fitness, meaning its attractiveness to the adopting society, conditional on the institutional environment in which it takes place. And then, of course, there's feedback from the environment, which created an extremely high level of complexity and makes any kind of predictability probably impossible. Secondly, and I mentioned that evolutionary systems throw up more variants than can it possibly accommodate, and that's the issue of superfecundity. And just to repeat, because this is critical to the whole story, nobody in biological evolution makes any choices. Selection is a metaphor. Here, people make conscious decisions. And so what that means, of course, that much like species, some ideas may go extinct when a more powerful new competitor comes around. Like, geocentric astronomy, where the Earth is in the center of the universe, basically went extinct, or sort of humoral theories of disease, things like that. But in many other cases, new ideas may coexist with the old one in some kind of mixed equilibrium if the competitive environment is insufficiently stringent. Okay, so if sometimes the vast bulk of humanity believes certain things, but it's very hard to prove distinctly, and so in that case, some people end up believing one thing, and some people end up believing another. And that happens when I use this term, when knowledge is untight. That means you can't really verify it by the rhetorical criteria of the time. So I understand there's still people who believe that the Earth is flat, or that dinosaurs and people spent time together on the planet, and other nonsensical things. But these things are fairly rare. But there are lots of areas in science where people disagree, simply because the knowledge isn't tight enough and it's hard to prove your case. Secondly, and I mentioned this already, evolutionary models can occur on different levels. And so you might sort of see this by thinking, people pick a particular idea that happens to increase their physical fitness in their environment. Well, if they do, their numbers will increase. And so the individuals who made the right choice, their numbers will grow, and that idea will then further thrive because there's more individuals believing it. And then this society turned out to be successful, and therefore can able sort of to influence or overtake another society. That's a further level in which selection occurs. So that's a debate that's happening in biology as well, whether the selection is on the genes or on the individuals or on the group, and so on and so forth and so forth. I'm not going to get into that. Then there's the question of resistance. Like all evolutionary systems, culture is resistant to change. And in a way, you probably want that. You want to have some kind of mechanism that gives a certain stability to the system and provide an ex ante advantage to incumbent cultural variants against innovations. But of course, the effectiveness of resistance depends on the content of the system itself. And so, you can think of this historically as, in cultural system, culture is tied up with what we call cultural capital. So people have made investments in current beliefs, and the value of those beliefs would decline if current beliefs were to be modified or overthrown. So and so they will resist. Now that resistance may or may not be successful, depending on how tight the knowledge is and how strong the forces for progress. But for instance, when the germ theory of disease was developed in Europe in the 1870s and 1880s, large chunks of the medical profession objected to it, not because they could prove it wrong, but because they had, spent their entire life, believing in miasmas or something else, and they said, I have too much of my human capital tied up in that, and then they could rationalize being against it. So that I think is something that both evolutionary and biological evolutionary and cultural evolutionary share. Now, then there is a question of dynamics. Basically any generalizations or predictions about dynamics as to the speed and direction at which cultural change are doomed. Sometimes culture changes at a tectonic pace, or it stays static for hundreds or even thousands of years, and it survives all kinds of institutional political shocks. But there have been times in history in which culture changes relatively quickly and dramatically, maybe because resistance is weak or for other reasons. So there's a little book by Eric Jones on on that, and it's kind of he sort of talks about it, when it's going to be fast and when it's going to be slow. But the same would have been true for biological evolution. I'll come back to it in a minute or two. Then there is and I think an evolutionary approach does give us a more reasonable way of thinking about how historical trajectories are being followed. And so I think there's sort of two extremes in this view. And one of you says that, everything that happens in history is inexorable and foreordained, this would be an orthodox Marxist view. And then there is a nihilist approach that basically says everything is random. We can make no prediction at all, sort of a Nick Kraft view of the Industrial Revolution. And so Jacques Monod, a great French biologist, actually wrote a book called Neither Fluke Nor Necessity. And basically it argues, look, history is not pure randomness, but nor is it necessity, and contingency is everywhere. And therefore, and this is something that I always tell my students, not everything that happened had to happen, and lots and lots of things that could have happened didn't. And so, and what it also tells you is, and this is sort of disturbing but inevitable, is similar circumstances don't always lead to the same outcomes, and similar outcomes don't have identical causes, and so this is Gerard Vermeer, who's another biologist, basically a Marxist. He says comparative history allows us to separate chance from necessity, and one would hope so. Then there is, and I'll come back to that as well, there's something which we call emergent properties, which I think we share with evolutionary models as well, and that is that large systems consisting of a large number of components may have properties that are very different from what the properties of each of the components, and therefore the sum may be larger than the total of the parts because of interactions or because of some other thing. That's basically the definition of emergent properties. That is a very important part of systems analysis, okay? And finally, and this is perhaps most controversially, is evolutionary actually progressive? Are we in some way, is the world getting more sophisticated, more advanced, better, and so on and so forth? And the, biologists are disagreeing with one another about each other. And I think here, cultural evolution clearly diverges from biological models that I shall argue below. So those are sort of the advantages that I think evolutionary models had for the economic history of Europe. And now what I want to do is go through those 9 points and essentially give some examples of in European history and show you how these things fit into this kind of framework. Okay, so the first is duality. And so the question is the interaction between what I call propositional knowledge, which is essentially knowledge of what you might think that's mostly overlapping with science, and prescriptive knowledge, which are essentially outcomes and therefore phenotypical. So the analogy isn't exact, and I don't want to make too much of it, but it's clear that in this period, the period of before this industrial revolution, there was something which we call the scientific revolution, which created many of the insights and methods that eventually created the industrial revolution and what came after. So there's a debate that I'm always arguing this with my dear friend Deirdre McCloskey and with others, to what extent any science at all were all that useful in the Industrial Revolution itself. As you look at particularly the sort of physics created by people like Galileo and then Newton, how useful was that in the Industrial Revolution? And the argument is probably not all that much. But there seems to be a consensus that the main reason why the Industrial Revolution didn't fizzle out after about 1815 was that the low-hanging fruits of technology had been picked, and that by now scientific insights were necessary, and they were increasingly brought to bear on practical questions. And so as you go deeper into the 19th century, you can see how more and more science becomes significant in stimulating and supporting technological progress. Now, even in the Industrial Revolution itself, which is often attributed to uneducated tinkerers, there are still some techniques that were dependent on the advances of formal knowledge. Above all, say, things like steam power, which depended, after all, on the discovery of atmospheric pressure and the existence of a vacuum and the expansive properties of steam and so on. And so in many other areas, and if you ask me about it, I'll give you a long list, advances in formal knowledge aided in the rise of productivity. Now, to be sure, the best was still to come after 1800, but it's not like successes in this area were not significant. And what's more, of course, the growth in the two kinds of knowledge, propositional knowledge or science and prescriptive knowledge or technology, creates a positive feedback loop. And this creates the kind of disequilibrium model that economists are uncomfortable with, but biologists are. Technology feeds back into science in many ways and augments the knowledge on which it is based. So you can sort of think about what certain inventions did for science, like the telescope, what they did for astronomy, and the microscope for biology, or in our own days, lasers and computers and, AI and whatnot. So technological advances make science easier, and then the science feeds back into further technology. And that, I think, seems to be a fundamental hallmark of modern progress. Secondly, the interaction between innovations and environment. As I said, mutations happen in an environment, and they will determine to what extent mutation is selected. But the environment in which innovations were generated is largely determined by what we would call in economics now institutions. So some institutions are repressive and reactionary, and therefore suppress innovation, and others were conducive to innovation and progressive. Now, again, there is feedback because innovations will affect the institutional environment, as we all understand. And so the feedback could be positive, it could be negative. You could write models that eventually lead to some kind of an equilibrium, or you could models that don't. But no matter what, new technologicals are going to interact with the institutions, and therefore the dynamics get much more complicated. So institutions, as we all realized, are the rules that constrain human behavior and actions. And I think this is how we should think about these sort of new institutional economics and how it can isolate the forces that shape history if you're willing to admit that it's technology that drives modernization. So what kind of institutions would have mattered here? And so the way that I think about it, and this is something on which my book is largely based, is that what you see happening in Europe in the centuries before the Industrial Revolution is the creation of a competitive market for ideas, in which you have a whole bunch of people in the upper tail of the human capital distribution, intellectuals and scientists and physicians and even some artisans, and they're selecting ideas from a menu. And when somebody adds an item to the menu, you could drop the thing that you believed in and now believe in something else. But these menus were often exclusive, so you couldn't believe both in Copernican and Ptolemaic cosmography. Either the sun is in the center of the universe, or the solar system at least, or the Earth, but not both of them. Nor couldn't you believe so in both Galenian and iatrochemical medicine, or you couldn't both be a Calvinist and a Catholic. I mean, people have to make choices, and there is a so-called market for ideas in which some people try to persuade you to see it their way. And so I think that is the main mechanism of the horizontal transmission through which people in the intellectual elite inform and persuade each other. That's reasonably well understood. And so that market, of course, got a huge boost with the printing press, but also with the rise of literacy and the proliferation of epistolary network, the growth of a competitive system of universities, scientific societies, and on and on and on. And all of those institutions mattered and showed how progress could be happening. Now, how were ideas selected? And so there's a menu in which people select, but how? And so the selection criteria are far from simple, and we don't really have a sort of coherent theory of cultural fitness. But what happens in the centuries before the Industrial Revolution is that the criteria by which people choose ideas are changing. And there's three things that stand out to my way of thinking that matter a great deal. The first is the growing use of mathematics in science, particularly, of course, in physics and astronomy, but other fields as well, which is, you see very little of it in earlier times. The second thing is the growing popularity of just cataloging and counting and classifying empirical regularity. So when you don't really understand the underlying mechanisms, that's what you do. And you look for empirical regularities in things like botany and zoology and geology. And finally, growing legitimacy of experimental work. So the Greek scientists, basically, particularly Aristotle, had nothing but contempt for people who do experiments. But already in the Middle Ages, you see little signs of that. But basically, it's not until the work of people like Francis Bacon in which experimental work becomes basically legitimate. And then it becomes essentially the rage, and people, discover all kinds of things thanks to experiments. And so basically, I would say, as these things become more widely used, it's easier for people in the upper tail of human capital distribution to select ideas because they can recognize a mathematical proof or an observational proof, something like that. So eventually Copernicus's view of the world won, not because of the rhetoric of the Evolutionary, his book, but because people found mathematics and empirical regularities that were consistent with it and not consistent with anything else. Now, it's important to realize that not all these choices look like adding global fitness. Okay, so there are certain things that were chosen, at least by a considerable number of people, that you wonder about today. So, for instance, there's something called iatrochemical medicine, which I already mentioned, that sort of is the result of the work of people like Paracelsus, who was a contemporary of Martin Luther, and Van Helmont, who lived a century later. And basically, this is a medicine that was an innovation compared to traditional medicine, which had been formulated by Galenus and before that by Hippocrates. But it was, by our standards, this was bogus. It was none of the practices that they recommended did any good. When they poisoned people with mercury rather than bloodletting them isn't much of an improvement. The same is true, say, for things like phlogiston chemistry, which is a bogus view of combustion, and Cartesian physics, which eventually was junked for Newtonian physics, and so on. But they were eventually unselected, but it took a long time, some of them not until the 19th century. At the same time, of course, there are certain things that are very tight and are accepted right away and improve life. Like you think about the computational power of logarithms invented in the early 17th century. And particularly when mathematics was decisive, selections were easier to make. Even so, deductive reasoning, had to be supplemented by observations. The field in which progress was the slowest by far is in medicine, and really, medicine is a complete, mess in terms of its, what people chose to do until the late 19th century, and even then there was resistance, as I already noted. Okay, so the level of selections issue, and so. My sense is that in the West, choices were made, and the selection of certain scientific principles and technological innovations did create a process by which the West attained material superiority that allowed it to dominate and exploit it in various ways and forms. And there was no arguing with success in the various techniques that the West developed, and much of the non-European world eventually adopted Western science. Some earlier, like Japan, and some, later, like China and Africa. But eventually, there's no arguing with success. What is, of course, interesting is that one would have predicted, certainly from the point of view of the 19th century, that this would lead to a huge population explosion in the West because it was so successful. And of course, that's not what happened at all. Demographic consequences were completely the opposite of what both Darwin and Malthus would have expected. But that's a story that would have to leave for another time. But one way or another, as I said, there is a higher level of selection in which it's not the individuals who make the choices, but that societies watching that other society that made choices were more successful. And so what we see today in the world is that even countries that don't particularly like the West, and I'm not going to list them, but you know what I'm talking about, but they still have shown the power of this mechanism. They not only adopt Western technology, but also Western music and Western dress and languages and religion and other cultural features are spreading to the rest of the world, in part because they were deemed to be successful in the West. Resistance. So cultural resistance to innovations is widely documented. I have a bunch of papers about that by now, probably out of date. And it's, as I said, resistance is important because not all proposed innovations are useful. Many of them are bogus, and not some of them are just mistakes, and others are fake news or misinformation, and need to be resisted. And at the same time, of course, too much resistance, and you end up with stasis or stagnation. And so, were there mechanisms that can effectively distinguish between the two? And the answer is, in the long run, very few truly bogus arguments have survived in the face of careful examination. Some of it was fairly early. So you're discovering, bogus authorship of knowledge, and an example which and for this Lavoisier's famous proof that phlogiston chemistry was erroneous, that kind of thing. And it's important to sort of think about, how strong is that resistance going to be? So as I said, some individuals resist innovation for selfish reasons, and because they have so much human capital invested in the status quo. There's Planck's famous remark about how science advances one funeral at a time, a bit exaggerated, but there's something to that. And at the macro level, of course, society can set up institutions that are deliberately designed to resist change and protect the stability of the regime at all costs. So, for instance, in Europe, there's the Holy Inquisition, which would, if you were doing things that were too novel, they could show up one day and accuse you of black magic. In a very different way, I would argue that the Chinese imperial examination system had this characteristic. Now, dynamics. And so I think this is actually a really interesting question. Is evolution always gradual? Is it always smooth? And so there's a debate among biologists. Some of them basically claim that evolution, by its definition, is always gradual and slow, and that there are no discontinuity. But there are some biologists, most famous, a man called Richard Goldsmith, now a fairly old book, which actually point out that there are what he called hopeful monstrosities. Okay, so some totally new species that appears through some kind of mutation, very discrete, that may actually create a new distinct species that occupies a new line. So I would argue that economic history is full of hopeful monstrosities that were, significantly different than what was there before, and at least few of them had sort of cascading evolutionary consequences in cultural domains. Now, not all of those macro inventions, as I have called them, were scientific. You can, of course, think about the Reformation, which was a major innovation, or the great voyages in the late 15th century, but also things like, for instance, the invention of perspective in paintings, in which you can sort of everything is perspective makes things look three-dimensional, which is attributed to a man called Filippo Brunelleschi in the early 15th century. Or you think about something like Spinoza's very revolutionary philosophical system. I mean, these are hopeful monstrosities. And so, of the hopeful monstrosities written at the time, I would probably think that most people would agree that there's two books that made all the difference. One is the Revolutionibus by this, which is the Copernicus book, and the other is Newton's Principia. But you could think of a whole bunch of others if you're willing to dig into this, like Galileo's Dialogo, for instance, or Gilbert's De Magnete, things like that. These are, radical changes in paradigm that sometimes, make a big difference. And I think it's fair to say that these sort of sudden jumps in history are too many to argue that everything is gradual, not to mention the fact that sort of new instruments make a big difference. And so what about contingency? So to what extent is early modern history deterministic, and to what extent is it inexorably decreed by deep historical forces? So in evolution, there always was contingency. And so the most striking example, of course, is the great asteroid that hit Chicxulub at the Yucatan Peninsula at the end of Cretaceous, 65 million years ago, that wiped out the dinosaurs. I mean, and so there are certain things that are equivalent to these asteroids. And the most striking things are the Mongols. Wherever the Mongols invaded, to some extent China, but certainly in India and the Middle East, they basically left economies in ruins for generations, and some think for much longer, okay? Now, the Mongols missed Europe, by and large. I mean, they invaded in 1241, and they spent some time in Eastern Europe, like in Croatia and Hungary and Poland, and left a path of utter destruction. And history might have been different if they have decided to go west. But then all of a sudden they withdrew and never came back. So that's, I think, Europe sort of basically dodging the asteroid of the Mongols, if I may say so. And so basically institutional outcomes always have had a large accidental component. They're a result of battles, of dynastic arrangements, powerful individuals, political compromises, and arbitrary maps drawn by generals and politicians. Okay, so by the 17th century, there were two sort of relatively tolerant countries, the Low Countries and Britain, but there was nothing inevitable about it. The Spanish could have overtaken the Low Country and even successfully invaded Britain, as they tried in 1588. So some critical juncture, to use the Acemoglu-Robinson term, could have turned out differently. Okay, you could write finally, and so there is a very nice novel by a British author called Kingsley Amis called The Alteration, in which he draws a picture of a Europe in which the Inquisition has won. Okay, and I think the way he pictures history is that Martin Luther, instead of setting up the Reformation, actually ends up in Rome and is elected Pope, and he becomes Pope as Germanicus I, and then he imposes this strict conservative Catholic regime on all over Europe. And so, if that world had taken place, or in some other way, the reactionary Jesuits have won, it's hard to think that out-of-the-box thinkers like Newton and Spinoza, say, or Toland and Lamettrie, people like that they would have been silenced, and the Enlightenment might never have taken off. And so, to repeat, beware hindsight bias. Not everything that happened had to happen, and lots of things that could have happened didn't. All right. Now, emergent properties. Okay, so we learned, I think general Darwinian models suggest that emergent properties are important in economic history. And so, so basically, I just defined what an emergent property is. It's essentially a system that is larger than its and different than its components. And the best example that I can think of is, in fact, the market for ideas. And this is something I write a bit about in my book. And there's this institution that supports the market for ideas, which I call the Republic of Letters. And the Republic of Letters is just basically a large number of interactions, usually between just two individuals or a small number of them, in which they exchange ideas and they write to each other and they try to persuade each other. But it's a very simple sort of thing that we all engage in. We write working papers, but you look at the system as a whole, it creates a community that has characteristics that is very different from what each individual has. And these characteristics are almost always unintended and unanticipated. They're not designed, they're not planned, and they're just the result of limited actions of individuals trying to do as well for themselves as they can. Finally, progress. So I don't know if there is progress in biological evolution. So the giants of evolutionary biology, like Stephen Jay Gould and Gerard Vermeer, they disagree. And so when these giants in biology disagree, a humble economist shouldn't venture an opinion, I think. But one can think of more general evolutionary models in which progress can take in a particular dimension, but not in other dimensions. For instance, there is in biology something called Cope's rule. So Cope's rule says that species, if left on their own, will experience a trend to get larger, physically larger. Okay, so the dinosaurs were left by themselves for hundreds of million years, and they got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And apparently, the same is true for humans and for lots of animals. And so this would be true, I think, if innovations weren't random and directed towards solving material problems. And so, so I think between 1500 and 1700, I think we can start seeing a movement toward progress and growth and rising living standards, which becomes increasingly pronounced in the 18th century with the Enlightenment. And of course, as I said earlier, if a belief in progress feeds back on actual progress, and actual progress feeds back into the belief in progress, and that sort of positive feedback mechanism is essentially at the basis of modernization. And so, I think we can sort of document that progress in the centuries before the Industrial Revolution quite clearly. And what Europeans are doing is, to some extent, engaging in acts of ecological arbitrage. Technological change may not have been all that powerful between 1750, but surely the Columbian Exchange, in which crops were moved from one place to another, did that. Now, in other dimensions, I think it's much more difficult to argue for progress. I have long sort of hoped or believed, hopefully, that institutions were in the long run improving as well. But, maybe in my waning years, I have come to doubt that. And I'm not really sure that institutions have failed to get much better since 1500. Surely, if there is a trend, it is far from monotonic. There have been serious setbacks in the quality of institution in the 1920s and in the 1930s, and again in the 21st century. And this is something which I haven't said very much about, because I don't know very much about it, and I don't think anybody else does. But are there selection mechanisms on institutions? And if so, is there a trend toward progress? And I think not. I think institutions are being selected, but not on in any way maximization social or economic welfare. Instead, the fitness of institutions involves power and control by relatively small groups that may have access to violence to maximize their rents and power, and there's no implication that it makes society in any way better. Now, I want to spend a few minutes on this issue of how this selection actually happening. And so I said it's basically sort of a Lamarckian thing. People choose ideas over their lifetime, and so we are not quite, exactly the way our parents are, even so what our parents believe may well be the default option. And so the deviations of what we get from horizontal transmission to what we actually believe in are sometimes known as biases, although that's a confusing term. And there are I have at least 9 different kinds of biases here, and I'm not going to go through all of them because it would take too much time, and I'm starting to run against a thing. But there's all kinds of biases that make us choose things based on various criteria. So one of them is the most obvious one, which is content, which is you look at somebody proves the theorem or does some empirical work that's very persuasive. You look at it, you say, yeah, that's right. I'm dropping what I believed earlier because this person has convinced me. Okay, and then there's what I call direct bias, which is you don't actually check the data yourself, but somebody tells you. So it's authorities or influencers, or if you want to call them, tell you basically this is right, this is wrong. It's not what your parents told you because I'm telling you differently. And some people believe that. And then there are all kinds of biases that are confirmation and consistency biases. There are the model-based bias, so you want to believe what some role model tells you. There's frequency dependence, conformism. There is internalizing existing norms. There is even coercion bias. Basically, believe what I'm telling you, I should kind of thing. That rarely seems to work very well. I mean, I think in both of the Nazi Germany and communist Russia, these biases don't seem to have much sustainability. And there is something which I call salient event bias, which something really catastrophic happens that may make people change what their parents told them, something like the Holocaust or the Black Death or something like that. So there's all these biases, and each of them, unfortunately, may affect how people form their beliefs and what they will select and what they will not select. And clearly the complexity of that will tell you that there's no one single easy model. And so here are some examples of the kind of changes that occurred in how these biases operate in early modern Europe. So new research methods like the telescope, or new methods in mathematics. The direct bias is particularly interesting because for much of the Middle Ages, the authority of what to choose and what not to choose was classical civilization. So people read Aristotle and a number of other members of what's known as the canon. And in early modern Europe, these are increasingly replaced by experts. And these experts are alive rather than dead, which is a big advance. But they were at the top of the knowledge pyramid, and they were made authorities basically by gaining a reputation among their peers. Okay, so somebody like, say, Dr. Fauci is a direct bias. Dr. Fauci tells you, you should get yourself vaccinated. A lot of people believe him, not unfortunately everybody. And so there is rhetorical bias. So we all know about internet and social media. At the time, of course, the equivalent would be the printing press. The other form of rhetorical bias is publishing in the vernacular languages instead of Latin, so that you could reach more people. And so, as I said, they were driven and supported by institutions in the Northian sense, but we don't actually have a very good theory of why these institutions emerge. So we should realize that they are like the environment, and in a biological, physical environment, in a biological process. And it's sort of, we have to keep in mind that not only that it's hard to explain why it's the way it is, but also how it interacts with what we're trying to explain. And so what we need above all, and I think this is something, a gap that North and many others have left open, is we need a coherent evolutionary theory of institutions. Why are some institutions picked, and why are others not picked? And we don't have that yet. And as long as we don't have that, I mean, this is going to be a very partial history of a theory of history, but it's basically all we have. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Professor Joe Mokyr.
All right, I'm basically done, so.
Okay, now let's invite Professor Gerard Rubin to give about 10 to 15 minutes discussion before we turn to the audience Q&A. Yeah, Professor Rubin.
All right, well, yeah, thank you, Ziwu and Chang, for inviting me. This is really just an amazing panel to take part of. I should start by saying that despite being an economist, I do not have slides, which kind of goes against our tribe, I know, but bear with me. So I think in general, to be around Joel is to learn from Joel, and this talk is no different. Yeah, commenting on it is just quite the task. The slides are more or less a book. I think in order to keep myself concise and to let the Q&A, people in the Q&A, I'm sure there are a ton of questions. I will focus on just a few of the things that really struck me the most, both from the slides and then Joel's discussion of those slides. And I want to start by pinpointing the one thing that I think, if I could push Joel to the extent that Joel needs to be pushed, to really just continue working on this and really make this into the book, is that what this talk has done and what this framework has done is it provides a framework for understanding economic history that is explicitly not deterministic. That's something that, as Joel mentioned in this talk, is something that, whether implicitly or explicitly, too often times both economic history and I think economics more generally views oppositely, even though I know myself, and I think a lot of economic historians, if you push them on it, would say that they believe economic history is not deterministic. The question is, how do we have a framework for thinking through history in such a way, and economic history in particular in such a way? And I think that cultural evolution processes hold a lot of promise on this front. They're explainable ex post. We don't want something where anything goes, but ex ante, they can go down several paths. And I think a related issue that really struck me towards the end of the talk, when Joel was talking about those easy to imagine counterfactuals, those that really set both his economic history, but I think more importantly on the type of stuff Joel was talking about in this talk, cultural evolution down a certain path. Joel came up with a few examples, the ones that immediately struck me, maybe just because it's the type of stuff I work on. What if Catherine of Aragon had several living boys? What if Martin Luther had been assassinated when he went into hiding at the Wartburg, which is something absolutely, there were plenty of people out there that were trying to do that very thing. These are both things that could have easily set Europe on a very different institutional path, cultural path, one that I would say almost certainly would have been much more repressive and probably had the types of, rather forbade institutions like the Republic of Letters from ever emerging. These are the types of things I think when you really think through them, and not even in too much depth, you immediately understand that history is not deterministic. The question is, though, how do we think through the processes through which economic history and evolution over time emerges? So on that point, I think it is really important to put structure on non-deterministic arguments. Just because economic history is non-deterministic, if we believe it is, and I certainly do, and I believe Joel does as well, that does not mean that anything goes, or that we can never hope to understand long-run causal pathways. That obviously is something that's very much in vogue, and I think for good reason in economics and economic history now, is trying to understand how societies evolve over time, how institutions evolve over time, the deep determinants of economic processes, and cultural evolution, and really taking it seriously and having a framework for thinking about it seriously provides a really, in my opinion at least, huge promise for doing so. So Joel noted in his talk that, for instance, similar circumstances do not always lead to similar outcomes. This is something I think we know very well. Recently you could say, imposing democracy in the Middle East or something like this, democracy just didn't work in certain parts of the world the way it does in others. I mean, even look at India in the present day. I have long believed that culture and how culture has evolved differently in those different societies is often the key to understanding exactly why this is the case. And the frameworks that Joel proposes here should, I hope, go a long way in helping us get an analytical grasp on these episodes. It's really the analytics that matter here. And again, now I'm repeating myself, but to not just say anything goes because history is not deterministic, but really thinking through a way to analyze it, and hopefully empirically too. I think this is something that perhaps the biggest promise of such a framework is now, maybe Joel, maybe somebody else thinks about ways to take these ideas and really think about how to test them empirically. So I have three major points that I want to get to, and then I will stop to allow for Q&A. So I think it's one thing, and this goes back to Joel's last book, Culture of Growth, and I think also to the Enlightened Economy, the 2009 book. I think it's one thing for the kind of what you might call the literati elite, not just the high-end human capital people, because high-end human capital can certainly mean skilled craftspeople of that type, but really the people that say would have been involved in the Republic of Letters. I think it's one thing for those people to have a cultural shift and say something in favor of progress, which is the idea behind the culture of, behind the culture of growth. I think it's another thing for those traits to diffuse in the population. And again, that can mean either to the other high-end human capital people, like the skilled mechanics. It could also mean to a broader set of people. Now, I think one thing we must agree upon, though, is that this must have happened at some point, because I think this is a standard cultural norm in the West. I do think that, again, Joel mentioned in this talk, maybe we don't all view progress as a good thing, but the idea that science can be used for progress is something that I think is unquestionable in most societies today. At some point, this happened. The question is when, and whom, right? So it seems important in what Joel has been saying, because those tinkerers and those those high-end human capital people that had skills with their hands. Those were not people that were going to be typically part of the Republic of Letters, sharing these ideas, sharing these cultural traits that had culture, that were evolving during the Enlightenment. Now, I have some recent work that Joel has seen that suggests that practical works of science that were aimed at larger audience started to become more progress-oriented in around the mid-18th century. Now, I think this timing works, and I think thinking through these types of issues works, because if we really want to think about the spread of these ideas and why this might have been important for long-run economic growth, we should expect, I think, as Joel has suggested here, that maybe these cultural changes did start from the very, very top, from what I'll call the literati elite, the people who actually sent these letters to each other. Then where would it spread from there? And again, this is the type of idea that I think we need to think through when thinking through cultural evolution processes, probably to the other high-end human capital folks who were, again, not the literati, but those people that were precisely the people that Joel's work, in other both the 2009 book and other works, let's say Cormac O'Grada, Morgan Kelly were central to industrialization. In fact, the timing that I just proposed here does suggest that these changes were happening just in time for Britain's industrialization. Now, a second thing, and this is more I'd like to pick Joel's brain on, and I know it's something he's thought a lot about, something that he mentioned in this talk, has mentioned in other books, but I want to do it specifically in this context, is the role that political institutions played in the Industrial Revolution happening where and when it did. So on the one hand, you might say, and these aren't mutually exclusive, that it's mostly for that when we think of institutions, are they forces that prevented change from occurring? Like say in China or possibly Spain, where you might have more autocratic institutions, or is it mainly a break? Or is there a more active role for the type of, say, limited governance that in degrees of freedoms, like McCloskey would highlight, at least for some people, maybe not religious minorities, in places like Great Britain, to a lesser extent the Dutch Republic, even though maybe even actually Dutch institutions were probably even better, despite the fact that they did not industrialize first. More to the point here, though, and this is where I think thinking through Joel's argument in this context is, how important were political institutions for the type of cultural evolution experienced in Europe during the Enlightenment? Is it just a matter of having fractionalized political institutions, or is there a more active role? It's something that I mean, Joel's the person to have the answer to this question. Just an open question. Last thing, and then I will stop because I know I'm running short on time. Is the degree to which the culture of growth, these Joel's terms, as well as the Enlightened economy, really substitute or complement for other explanations of industrialization? Now, I think that we would all agree, I think, to some degree, that that something like industrialization is a multi-causal process, some of which, some factors might have been necessary, probably none were sufficient. This is something that I tried to think through with Mark Clayam on the book that you mentioned at the beginning. I'm thinking when we're talking specifically about cultural evolution, there's things like relative factor prices, a la Allen, which I think are a bit of more of a stretch. There is the shift towards the Atlantic. That you could say that maybe the Ashimoglu type shifted toward the Atlantic, where you're talking about trade, or the new history of capitalism / slavery shift to the Atlantic. There's political institutions, like I just mentioned. There's a recent book, as I know Joel knows, by Jeffrey Hodgson on this. In your own work, and really, your own work with, especially this, the forthcoming book, but also the article you just published with Kelly and O'Grada on skilled workers. And really, I again, this is more me just wanting to know what you think about this. I'm less interested, on the one hand, if one of those things is the factor. I think that a lot of these things played some role in some circumstances, less of a role in others. But really, how these factors might have substituted for or complemented these cultural changes that were emerging at this time that you have emphasized in this talk and previously. And with that, I will stop.
All right. Well, I don't want to take up too much time, so we just raised enough points for me to fill another hour, but I'm not going to do that because that's unfair to the audience. The one issue that he raises, and I think that is something I've been thinking about a lot, is how do ideas filter down from the people who actually generate ideas, people who read, who talk to each other, intellectuals, educated people, how do they actually filter down to the rest of the population? And this is actually, I think, a very deep historical question, which we really still have a hard time fully answering it. And I think the one thing, of course, that matters above all is how do these things affect productivity? I mean, how do they affect the technology? And I think what you see happening during much of the 19th century is mass education and trying to bring the working classes up to some standards of what the middle class used to be. But that's, I think, only a very partial success. And one solution is basically, and particularly in Britain, this was very much the case, is essentially creating a segmented society in which the elite and the working class basically don't mix, and in which a lot of technology is designed to essentially keep workers basically of low levels of skills and low level of literacy, and instead make the machines more sophisticated by front loading all the ingenuity. You look at something like the self-actor, for instance, okay? So that's a machine in which an enormous amount of ingenuity is front-loaded by a mechanical genius called Richard Roberts, and essentially it made skills redundant. And so you don't actually need very much of these ideas to filter down. But, and that's where your other question comes in, it becomes important because once society switched to one person, one vote, that's when you really need to educate the masses at a much higher level. And if you fail to do that, you may get all kind of conflicts between different groups in society. And of course, the history of the 20th century is very much an indication of that. And each society solves these problems in its own way. That said, I would still insist that in almost all societies, certain forms of progress, whether it's technological, scientific, is basically created by a very small number of people, this sort of Hooke's Cartesian army, and that the rest of us just basically just march along. And they don't need to be, now this is a long debate, which I'm probably getting into trouble for, because I don't mean to say that I don't believe in raising the level of the working classes from an educational point of view, quite the contrary. But I also think that what really, if you want to continue technological progress, push the capability of what societies can do, it always will be 1, 2, 3% of the population that will push the envelope and drag everybody along with them, because that is the very nature of how technological progress works. It isn't a democratic process, it isn't a mass process. It's a process primarily of the cleverest, best educated or smartest people in society that basically say things that others don't see because they have the capability of, thinking outside the box. Anyway, this is a long conversation that we should have over a big bottle of red wine. And I hope to do this soon, Jared, because it's always fun. Sorry, there's only a few minutes left for questions, but I'm not going anywhere, so I could stay longer if needed. But let's get some.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Mokyr, and thanks, Professor Rubin's discussion. Yeah, for time reason, let me just choose 2 questions from our audience. The first is a question from Sylvia Stern. It's a very long question. Let me read out. Professor Mokyr, you delineate culture from neuroevolutionary choice approximately in the same way brains and mind are delineated. In the first case, the occurrence of choice. In the second, no conscious elements of a choice process. Nevertheless, cultural beings, albeit ontological, irreducible to are biological beings. Thus, the occurrence of a choice and the range of consciously perceived number of options be a function of collective memory reservoir. Evolutionary process, the congruent with those anxiety levels, risk-reducing institutions. So what would, in your conceptualization, be the condition and the link among the elites and the bottom-up transitions for emancipation from hereditary instinctive restrictions, while substituting those through unidentical marginal replication into the realm of culturally determined, per definition, broadening scope of rational choice, danger perception? Sorry for the long question.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure actually what the question precisely entails, but I mean, I know Sylvia, and she always asks very good questions that I find or that I find hard to answer, and this may be one of them. But I think she what she points out is what I was just saying, which is that within each population, there is a large continuum of people. We can think of it as following some kind of sort of normal distribution, and that any theory of social and economic progress is going to have to worry about what happens to the other 97% of the population if the 3% of the population, the people at at MIT and at Caltech and in Silicon Valley, are pushing the economy ahead. And I think we're seeing this playing out throughout the 20th century. And this is the kind of thing I was thinking about when I was talking about resistance, because evolutionary systems have this kind of resistance in the sense that there are people who will always object to progress, not because they're irrational, as Sylvia suggests, but because their interests are at stake. And I think one of the implications of my talk today is that I insist on talking about the importance of the 2 or 3% of the population pushing the envelope, but we need to worry day and night, 24/7, about how that affects the other 97, because the other 97 can resist, and they can object, and they can protest, and they can rebel, and they have done so repeatedly. And then, the outcome of that struggle is between, is essentially indeterminate in some places. The three, in particular in Britain in the Industrial Revolution, the leading elites were able to get the government to come in and suppress things like the Luddite Rebellion, for instance, in 1812, 1816. In France, similar things happened, particularly in 1848, with the July Revolution in Paris. So these conflicts are, in some sense, inevitable in the kind of processes that I talked about. And I think where Jared's point about political system is exactly to the point, is to what extent is the political system set up to solve these conflicts between the people who push for progress and the people who are dragged along, some of them willy-nilly, many of them, of course, who are losers in the process, because technological change, as I have been saying all my life, is never a Pareto optimal process. It is always people who lose in the process for one form or another. And even so, in principle, the winners could compensate the losers. In practice, we all know that process is highly imperfect. But thank you for your question, Sylvia.
Okay, thank you. The last question is from Ghassan Moazin. Professor Mokyr, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I know, of course, that both in Liver of Riches and A Culture of Growth, you have discussed the reasons that held back the development of useful knowledge in Qing China to a certain extent. For example, lack of interstate competition like in Europe, political institution limiting the space for independent cultural entrepreneurs. But I was wondering whether you could speak a bit more about how your thinking on China has evolved on this question since A Culture of Growth, especially from the perspective of the evolutionary approach you discussed today. Yeah.
well, so the good news is that in addition to the book that Jared mentioned, I'm now basically almost finishing a book with two other co-authors, Avner Greift and Guido Tabellini. And I think to most people in this audience, these names should ring a bell. Certainly for Jared it will, which is basically an attempt to understand precisely what this person asked, which is, why is it that things that this big the great divergence between China and Europe happens in more or less exactly the period that I'm talking about, which is from the middle of the 17th century onward. The gap between China and Europe keeps opening up, and we all know that the Chinese had an incredible technological capabilities under the Song Dynasty, and before, and the Tang and so on. And so, it's maybe a bit crude and a bit vulgar, but I'm not the first one to raise this question, which is basically raised by many Chinese scholars, and that's essentially, why did China get off the path of economic growth? And I think there's no simple answer to that, but I think the main answer would be something like this. And and in fact, I wrote about this in the Livre Riches, and and in other places. But what happens is that in China and in Europe, from the early Middle Ages on, there is a massive divergence in what we would call social organization. And that is, I think, the great insight that the original 2017 paper of Greift and Tabellini provided, and we're just essentially elaborating on this and filling some of the gaps. But the idea is essentially that in China, what you get is, on the one hand, a powerful imperial centralized government in a unified state, and on the other hand, at the local level, most of it is run by extended families or clans. And that in contrary, Europe remains fragmented into many different states which compete with each other. But at the local level, government is carried out by what Greift famously called corporations, which are people who are not related and who basically get together for a common objective. And the difference between a society organized by clans and a society that's organized by corporation is far deeper and far more penetrating than that people who originally pointed to this have discovered. And so I would say, for instance, that it explains the rise of democratic institutions in Europe, even if it's very uneven, whereas in China, really, it never has been much of a democratic tradition. But there are many other implications of that. For instance, the kind of Republic of Letters that I mentioned earlier, and that Jared mentioned, we don't actually see a competitive market for ideas in China, or it's competing on very narrow margins. Essentially, particularly under the Qing, but even earlier under the Ming, essentially there is a monopoly in the market for ideas, that if you diverge too much from the Neo-Confucian orthodoxy, you can get yourself into serious trouble. And I think that's where the big difference occurs, in the sense that in Europe, you can also get yourself into trouble because if the government didn't like you, but you could always go, could go somewhere else. In China, because of the kind of society that it created, with a powerful imperial government on the one hand, and clans who collaborated with on the other, you got stability, you got a society that at many levels functioned extremely well, but in which there was no engine of progress. And in Europe, if you didn't have an engine of progress and your neighbors did, you would fall behind. Okay, and that, I think, is a huge difference. Now, this is particularly marked under the Qing dynasty, because the Qings were more reactionary, I think, than previous empires, in part because they wanted stability above all. They were, after all, they are usurpers, they're Manchurians, they're not really Chinese, all that stuff. But this is and a huge question, and our book makes a modest contribution to it, but we just had, and you were there, so you know, we just had a conference about this, and we talked about many of those issues, and I think we made some progress, but there's still a long road ahead. And I think your own paper, actually, Chi-Cheng, I thought was quite a significant contribution to this, because what you point out is something really important, which is that part of the culture that came to the fore in Europe is essentially a culture in which we no longer are under the tyranny of what previous generations thought. And whereas in China, as you pointed out, there's good evidence that as late as the 19th century, you know, the heavy hand of past generations is still suppressing the kind of progress that other people would like to see in a society. And so this is a huge question, and I can suggest to the person who asked the question, if you could hang on just, you know, a few more, maybe another year, our book may be out, and you should buy 17 copies.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Mokyr. Well, in the end, I think Professor Ziwu Chen wants to say something.
Oh, not too much, but let me thank both Professor Mokyr and Professor Rubin. But maybe let me make one last attempt to ask something, because last week we held an event to honor the 300th birthday of Adam Smith at the University of Hong Kong, together with the University of Glasgow. So now, you know, in some recent surveys, Adam Smith is still voted by far as the by far most influential economist for, I mean, literally over the last 3 centuries, and he may remain so for a while to come. So from the perspective of cultural evolution, I guess so many things have happened over the last 2 centuries after the Industrial Revolution, especially now with the internet, and we're now even talking about open AI and so on. So maybe this evolutionary process for ideas has stagnated or otherwise.
Oh, no, I know. I mean, we're generating more ideas than ever before, and not only that we're generating more ideas, we even build machines that generate ideas for us, which would be, you know, which is nobody ever suspected. But I want to say something, since you raised the point, as you would raise one footnote I want to put. So one of the things that I didn't get around to talk about, because I had to limit myself, is that one of the interesting things about cultural evolution is the existence of, you know, cultural entrepreneurs. That is to say, people who change the thinking of a large number of other people by making it sort of a huge impact. You think about, you know, somebody, and who actually changed history in the process. So you think about somebody like Muhammad, say, or you know, Darwin, whom I mentioned a lot. And in economics, basically, I think Adam Smith should be thought of as a cultural entrepreneur, in the sense that he changed the thinking, you know, of basically a very large subset of the upper tail human capital. You know, I mean, he's, as you said, he was incredibly influential. I would say he probably have to share that honor with Karl Marx to some extent, and maybe even with John Maynard Keynes. Also, we could debate that. But obviously, some people change the thinking of, and they put culture, they put a large thing on the menu that people can now choose. You know, Martin Luther would be another such person, right? So all of a sudden there's a new menu and we have to choose. And the same, I think, was true for Adam Smith, and it was true for Marx, and so on and so forth. And I think that is a little bit how cultural evolution moves. And that's why I was talking about hopeful monstrosity. You know, the Wealth of Nation was a hopeful monstrosity. It was a major leap forward, even so Schumpeter argued that there was nothing new in the wealth of nations, that every idea in the wealth of nations had already been propounded by somebody else. But then Schumpeter was a bitter old man when he wrote that book, so maybe we should take that too seriously. But Smith, as you said, was incredibly influential. And at some point, people had to choose whether you actually went with Adam Smith's view of the world, which had certain strong policy implications, anti-mercantilist, anti-regulation, anti-various constraints that, and particularly strong against things like rent-seeking and interest groups, and which he identified all over England still in 1776. And so that is I think a central component of cultural evolution are these cultural entrepreneurs, and who put new items on the menu. So it's as if you're sitting in a restaurant. You go to a restaurant every day, and then you come in, and all of a sudden there's a new item on the menu, and you have to make a new choice. And some people, make the choice, and some people don't. That's what selection is about.
Okay, great. So time's up.
All right.
Many thanks again to Professor Mokyr and
this was great fun. I could still go on, but I think we went a little bit over time. So Jared, thank you so much for doing this at short notice, and thank you Chi-Cheng and you for organizing this. I had a ball, and next time maybe we do this in person. Since I've been in Hong Kong.
Yeah, great. Yeah,
Okay, great.
Definitely.
Thank you.
All right, have a nice day, and good night.
Thank you so much. And we will have a Easter Day break. So happy Easter Day. And after that, we will come back on April 13. So please stay tuned with us for the news. Thank you so much. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.